The moment my granddaughter stood up in that boardroom and said, "Grandpa, I need to show everyone something, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I felt the floor drop out from under me. I didn't know what she had. I didn't know how long she'd been carrying it. All I knew was that every person in that room, my son, my daughter-in-law, their lawyer, and the trust officer from the bank, had gone completely still, and then she pressed play. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, because none of what happened in that boardroom makes sense without understanding what the 3 years before it did to me. My name is Arthur. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a property management company in the Okanagan. Started with one rental duplex in Kelowna in 1989, grew it to a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across the interior. By the time I sold the business in 2019, my wife Carol and I had more than we ever expected to have. We weren't wealthy in the way people on television are wealthy, but we were comfortable. Deeply, genuinely comfortable. We owned our home outright. We had RRSPs, a healthy non-registered account, and a paid-up insurance policy. Carol used to joke that we'd done everything the financial planner told us to do, and somehow it had actually worked. Carol passed in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't talk much about that because I still can't do it without my hands shaking. What I'll say is that she was the kind of person who made everything make sense, and when she was gone, I felt like I was trying to read a map in a language I didn't speak. Our son Phillip was 41 at the time. He lived in Kamloops with his wife Renata and their 2 kids, Milo, who was 16, and Isla, who was 13. We'd always been close, or at least I thought we had. Phillip took Carol's death hard, and I told myself the distance that opened up between us was just grief doing what grief does. I gave him space. I gave myself space. I thought we were both just healing. What I didn't realize was that while I was healing, Phillip and Renata were making plans. It started with the phone calls. Phillip began calling more often after Carol passed, which I welcomed because God knows I needed to hear a familiar voice. At first the calls were just catching up, asking how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, normal son checking on Dad's stuff. But slowly over months, the conversation began to shift. "Dad, have you thought about what happens if something happens to you? Dad, Carol handled a lot of the finances, right? Are you sure you understand everything? Dad, properties are a real headache to manage. What if you needed to go somewhere, someplace with more support, and you had to deal with all that at the same time?" I brushed it off the first dozen times. I told him I was fine. I told him I had an accountant, a financial advisor, and a lawyer, all people Carol and I had worked with for years. I wasn't some confused old man stumbling around in the dark. I still went to the gym 3 mornings a week. I still drove myself everywhere. I still cooked my own meals and paid my own bills and had dinner with friends on Fridays. But Phillip was persistent in a way that was hard to name. He never said anything alarming outright. He never accused me of anything. He just kept planting seeds. Quiet, careful seeds. Then Renata started calling on her own. I want to be honest about Renata, because I think I owe it to the truth. I never disliked her. She was organized, capable, socially confident. The kind of person who ran every school committee and remembered everyone's birthday. When Phillip first brought her home, Carol had said privately that Renata reminded her of a general who'd decided to marry into a smaller army. I'd laughed at the time. Later, I understood exactly what Carol meant. Renata's calls were warmer than Phillip's, more personal, more careful. She asked about my neighbors, my doctor's appointments, whether I was getting out enough. She started coming by more often with the kids when Phillip had to work. She'd bring casseroles, help me sort through some of Carol's things. I was grateful. I was lonely. I let her in further than I should have, and it was Renata who first used the word. We were sitting in my kitchen in October of 2022. She'd brought a chicken pot pie and a bottle of red wine, and we were talking about nothing in particular, and then she set down her glass and said, "Arthur, I want to say something and I hope you'll hear me out, because I'm saying it from love." I said, "Of course." She said, "I've noticed some things lately. Little things. You repeated the same story about the Rutland property twice in one conversation last week. You forgot Milo's birthday, which, look, that happens, but you've never forgotten before. And when I was here last month, You left the stove on when we went to get groceries." I opened my mouth to say I was fine, and she held up her hand gently. "I'm not saying anything is wrong. I'm saying, don't you think it might be worth talking to someone? Just to rule things out? For your own peace of mind?" I went to my doctor 2 weeks later. He ran some standard cognitive assessments. He said I was performing well within the normal range for my age, that there was no cause for concern, that some memory variation was entirely expected after the kind of loss I'd experienced. He suggested grief counseling. He did not suggest I was losing my mind. I told Phillip what the doctor said. I expected that to be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the following months, the pattern accelerated. I started noticing that things weren't where I'd left them, not in a dramatic way, not in a movie way, just small displacements. My reading glasses on a different shelf. A folder of documents I was sure I'd left on the desk in my office, now in the filing cabinet. My spare key, which I kept on a hook by the back door, had been moved to a kitchen drawer. I told myself I was doing it without thinking. I told myself this was what getting older meant. Phillip and Renata had been spending more time at the house, helping out, they said. They both had keys. It didn't occur to me to suspect them because I trusted them, and I'd spent 67 years in a world where that trust made sense. In January of 2023, Phillip sat me down and said he thought it was time to talk about a power of attorney. He'd brought a folder. He'd clearly prepared. He explained that he wasn't trying to take anything away from me. He just wanted to make sure that if something were to happen, if there were a health event, a fall, a situation where I wasn't able to manage things temporarily, there was a plan in place. He said, it was what Carol would have wanted. That last part landed harder than anything else. I don't know if he knew it would. But Carol's name in that context made me feel like the floor was tilting. I said I'd think about it. I called my lawyer, Gordon, the next day. Gordon had done our wills, our estate planning, all of it. He was cautious. He said a power of attorney wasn't inherently problematic, that many people set them up as a sensible precaution, but that the scope and the conditions mattered enormously. He said if I was feeling pressured, I should take my time. I told him I wasn't sure if I was feeling pressured or just being looked after. He said those two things could sometimes look identical from the inside. I didn't sign anything that January or that spring, but the pressure didn't stop. It just changed shape. Renata began forwarding me articles about estate planning for seniors. Phillip started making small comments about my driving. One night at dinner at their house, Renata said in front of the kids that she'd spoken to a friend who worked at a really lovely continuing care residence in Kamloops, and wasn't it worth at least going to look? I was 66 years old. I went to the gym 3 times a week. I had a doctor who'd told me I was fine. But I was also alone, and I was grieving, and I was starting to believe, in some small dark corner of myself, that maybe I was missing something. Maybe I wasn't as sharp as I thought. Maybe this was just what happened, and the people who loved me were trying to help me face it. That is the most dangerous kind of manipulation, the kind that wears the face of love so convincingly that you start to doubt your own reflection. In April of 2023, I signed a limited power of attorney. I told myself it was limited, it was temporary, it was just a precaution. Phillip gained authority to act on my behalf for financial matters in situations where I was incapacitated or unavailable. I told Gordon I was comfortable with it. I wasn't really, but I was tired of fighting something I couldn't see clearly. What happened next happened slowly, and then all at once. Phillip began helping with my accounts. Just organizing things, he said. Making sure the automatic payments were set up correctly. He had a background in finance. He'd worked in commercial lending for years, and he framed everything as using his expertise for my benefit. He started attending meetings with my financial advisor on my behalf, or alongside me. He started being CC'd on communications from my accountant. I stopped understanding exactly what was happening with my money. Not in a dramatic way. My day-to-day accounts were fine, my bills were paid. But when I tried to look at the bigger picture, the investments, the property holdings I still had, there was always a layer of complexity that Phillip was on hand to explain away. In November of 2023, he told me he'd found a buyer for my West Bank property. A commercial unit I'd held onto after selling the business, one that was generating solid rental income every month. He said the market was peaking, that it made financial sense to liquidate, that he'd run the numbers and the sale proceeds as invested conservatively would outperform the rental yield. I asked to see the numbers. He showed me a spreadsheet. I looked at it for 20 minutes and I still couldn't make it add up the way he said it did. I called Gordon and asked him to look it over. Gordon had questions. Phillip said Gordon wasn't a financial expert and was being overly cautious. I hesitated. I asked for more time. I said I wanted to call my financial advisor directly. That evening, Renata called me. Not Phillip. Renata, and she said, gently, kindly, in the voice she used when she was about to say something she'd clearly rehearsed, that she was worried about me, that she'd noticed I'd been going in circles on decisions lately, that this was something she'd read about, a kind of decision fatigue combined with cognitive changes, very common, very treatable, but worth taking seriously. She said she'd made an appointment with a geriatric specialist. She just wanted to help. I lay awake that night for a long time. I want to tell you I saw it clearly then. I want to tell you I sat up and thought, this is a con. These people are running a long, careful con on a grieving old man. I want to tell you I was sharp enough to see it. But I wasn't, or I wasn't sure enough. And that uncertainty, that sliver of self-doubt, was all they needed. I went to the appointment with the geriatric specialist. He ran a full assessment. He said I showed some signs of stress-related cognitive load, which was consistent with bereavement and social isolation, and that he recommended a structured routine, social engagement, and monitoring. He did not diagnose me with dementia. He did not say I was incapacitated. He did not say anything that should have supported what Phillip did next. But Phillip used that report anyway. In February of 2024, he filed an application with the BC Supreme Court to have himself appointed as my committee, the legal term in British Columbia for a guardian and manager of an incapacitated adult's affairs. He didn't tell me he was filing it. I found out when I received a legal document in the mail. I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice. Then I put it down and sat very still for a very long time. The application characterized me as someone who had been showing significant and progressive cognitive decline since the death of my spouse. It cited the specialist's report carefully, selectively, in ways that made a picture of mild concern look like documented incapacitation. It cited my confusion around financial decisions. It said I had expressed uncertainty about my own capacity. It was my son's signature at the bottom of the document. My son who had learned to ride a bike in the driveway of the house I was being talked out of. My son who I had put through university, helped with his first down payment, held when Carol was dying. I called Gordon. Gordon said we needed to respond immediately and that we needed to move fast. He referred me to a litigation lawyer who handled adult guardianship cases. Her name was Patricia, and she was the kind of person who made you feel like the room got a little cleaner the moment she walked in. Patricia told me the application was aggressive and that its factual basis was weak, but that these proceedings could take months, and that in the interim, the court might impose temporary measures. She told me to document everything, to stop signing anything, and to let her handle all communication with Phillip and Renata. I did what she said. And then, 3 weeks before the formal hearing, Isla called me. She was 15 by then, Phillip and Renata's younger kid, my granddaughter. She and I had always been close in the way that skips a generation sometimes. She liked to bake. She liked true crime podcasts. She had her mother's organizational mind, and her father's stubbornness and something that was entirely her own, a kind of quiet, patient attention to things that other people brushed past. She called me on a Tuesday evening. She said, "Grandpa, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." I said, "Okay." She said she'd been worried about me for a long time, not because she thought I was losing my mind, but because she'd seen things at home that had been bothering her, things she didn't fully understand, but that didn't feel right. She said she'd tried to talk to Milo about it, and he'd told her to stay out of it. She said she'd thought about telling me sooner, but she was scared that I wouldn't believe her, or that it would make things worse. And then she told me what she had. Over the previous 8 months, Isla had been, quietly, systematically, gathering evidence. She'd used the voice memo app on her phone to record conversations she'd overheard in her own home. Conversations between Philip and Renata about my finances, about the West Bank property, about what the committee application would allow them to do. She'd photographed documents she'd seen on Philip's desk. She'd written down dates and times of things she'd witnessed. She had recordings of Renata saying, word for word, that the geriatric specialist's report was enough to work with even if it wasn't exactly a slam dunk. She had a recording of Philip saying that once the committee order came through, the first thing to do was to move the investment accounts before he cottons on. She had a photograph of a spreadsheet, not the one Philip had shown me, a different one, that showed the projected proceeds from the West Bank sale going into an account I didn't recognize. She was 15 years old, and she had built a case that my litigation lawyer later described as more organized than most of what I get from adults. I didn't say anything for a long time after she finished talking. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the phone, waiting. I said, Isla, are you safe? She said yes. She said she'd been careful. She said she'd been waiting until she had enough. I told her I loved her. I told her she was the bravest person I knew. And then I called Patricia. The hearing was a Tuesday morning in March. I wore a jacket Carol had always liked, a gray wool blazer I'd had since before Philip was born. It was probably old-fashioned. I didn't care. Patricia had submitted Isla's evidence in advance as part of our response package. The recordings had been reviewed by the court. The opposing counsel, Philip and Renata, had their own lawyer, which still makes something tighten in my chest when I think about it, had tried to have them excluded on the basis that they'd been obtained without consent. The judge had allowed them, noting that the recordings were made in a private residence by a minor who was a member of that household. When we walked into the hearing room, Philip looked at me and then looked away. Renata looked at her phone. Patricia presented our case. She walked through the timeline. She walked through the selective use of the specialist's report. She played excerpts from the recordings. When Renata's voice came out of the speaker, calm, careful, clinical, describing how to use a grieving man's medical appointment as a legal lever, the room was very quiet. The judge asked to speak with Isla separately, in a less formal setting. I sat in the hallway while that happened. I had a terrible coffee from a paper cup. I watched people walk in and out of other rooms with their own difficult stories, and I thought about how much of what happens to people never gets seen. The application was dismissed. The judge's written reasons, which I received 2 weeks later, noted that the evidence provided demonstrated not cognitive decline on the part of the respondent, but rather a coordinated effort by the applicant and his spouse to create the conditions under which decline might be inferred. She used the word orchestrated. She referred the matter to the Law Society and to Crown Counsel for review. I'm not going to tell you what happened to Philip and Renata after that, as if it's a satisfying movie ending, because life doesn't work like a movie. What I'll tell you is that the Crown did pursue charges, that the civil proceedings around the West Bank sale, which had in fact gone through before I understood the full picture, and whose proceeds had been partially redirected, were separate and ongoing, that Gordon and Patricia were both working on that front, and that I had cautious reasons to believe the outcome would be reasonable. What I'll tell you is that Milo, who is 19 now, reached out to me 6 months after the hearing. We had a long, difficult conversation. He said he'd known something was wrong but hadn't known what to do. I told him I understood that. I told him I didn't hold it against him. I meant it. What I'll tell you is that Isla comes to Kelowna once a month. We bake. We watch old hockey games. She's in grade 10 now, doing well in school, talking about studying law. I tell her she'd be very good at it. She rolls her eyes and says she's thinking about it, not deciding. Last fall, I started attending a grief support group at the community center. Something I should have done years earlier, something Carol probably would have nudged me toward gently until I agreed. I've met good people there. I go for walks. I cook real meals again. My financial advisor and I have rebuilt a clear picture of where things stand. It took time. Some of it still makes me angry in a way I'm learning to sit with, rather than fight. But here is what I know, and what I want to say clearly, because I think there are people who will hear this story and recognize something in it. Losing your partner doesn't just break your heart. It breaks the system of checks and balances you've built with someone over decades. The second set of eyes, the voice that says, wait, let me look at that too. The person who knows when you're tired, and when you're being pressured, and when something doesn't add up. When Carol died, I lost all of that at once. I was functioning, I was competent, but I was alone with my own judgment in a way I'd never been before, and that made me vulnerable in ways I didn't see. That vulnerability was not a medical condition. It was grief, it was human, it was not an invitation. I used to think that the people most likely to take advantage of you were strangers. I understand now that love, or the performance of love, patient and careful and dressed in concern, can be the most effective cover there is. That the people who can hurt you most are not the ones who never had access. They're the ones who did. The morning after the hearing was dismissed, I drove out to the lake. It was still cold. Early March in the Okanagan, the light thin and white, the water very still. I sat in the car for a while, and I thought about Carol, the way I do, and I said some things out loud that I won't repeat here. And then I drove home, and I called Isla, and I asked her what she wanted to bake that weekend. She said cinnamon rolls. She said she'd found a recipe that was supposedly foolproof, and she wanted to see if that was actually true. I told her I would have the butter softened and ready. That's enough. For now, that's enough.